My name is Colin Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and on Christmas night, I watched my family sell me the legacy I built without knowing I was the buyer. The fire crackled in my parents' living room, the same house that still smelled of pine cleaner and roasted ham. My father, Rick Mercer, stood at the head of the table like a general before his troops, glass raised high. My mother, Elaine, tried to keep her smile steady. Tyler, my younger brother, was leaning back in his chair, the kind of grin you only wear when you already know you've won. Dad tapped his glass. "Tonight's special," he said, voice thick with pride. "After decades of sweat, we're moving into the future. Mercer Logistics has been sold to Asterian Capital, a brilliant firm, full of promise. And Tyler," he turned to him with that blinding smile, "will lead the next chapter." The table erupted in claps. Forks hit plates. Someone said congratulations. I didn't. I just sat there, tasting the metallic edge of the wine, watching the reflection of the fire in my glass. No one noticed my hands weren't shaking. No one saw how long I'd rehearsed this moment. Dad's voice filled the room again. "To family," he said. "To legacy." I lifted my glass, slow and calm. "To clarity," I answered. He laughed politely, half distracted. "What's that supposed to mean?" I looked at him, then at Tyler, then back again. The house seemed to hold its breath. "It means," I said quietly, "Asterian Capital is mine." The sound that followed wasn't silence, it was disbelief solid enough to feel. My mother's glass slipped, shattering. Tyler's grin collapsed into confusion. Dad froze mid-blink, searching my face for the joke that wasn't there. What they didn't know was that this night, the night they thought they'd finally cut me out, was the night everything they'd built began to belong to me. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from, and hit like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by family. I grew up in a warehouse. Not the kind kids dream about, no secret hideouts or skylights. Just cold concrete, oil stains, and the echo of forklifts reversing. My father, Rick Mercer, built his empire there. Mercer Logistics started with one truck and a promise: if you can move it, we'll deliver it. When I was 12, I became part of the we. Every Saturday, while other kids played video games, I swept aisles lined with pallets taller than me. My pay was a slice of pizza and the illusion that I was helping the family. Rick liked to remind me of my role. "You're reliable, Colin," he'd say, clapping my shoulder with that heavy-handed affection that felt more like branding than praise. Every family needs one. Tyler, my younger brother, was different. He never had to sweep. He'd show up to the warehouse in clean sneakers, holding a soda, chatting with the drivers like he was already running the place. My dad loved it, called it charisma. Mom would watch from the office doorway, smiling like everything was normal. She believed in peace at any cost, even if the cost was me. One afternoon when I was 16, a client came by unexpectedly. I'd just finished labeling an outgoing shipment. Grease on my forearms, dust in my hair. Dad led the man past me, pointing like a tour guide. "This is Colin," he said. "He keeps the lights on. But Tyler will take us global." The client smiled politely. Tyler wasn't even there. I swallowed whatever that moment wanted me to feel. Later that night, at dinner, Dad talked for 20 minutes about Tyler's vision for expansion. Tyler had mentioned, offhand, that we should paint the trucks a brighter color. That was his contribution. Mine, a new inventory tracking spreadsheet that had just saved us thousands in missed orders, went unmentioned. Mom tried to change the subject. "Colin, dear, did you eat it all today?" I nodded. "Yeah, ate pride for lunch." She laughed softly, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. By college, I had learned the art of being invisible in plain sight. I studied business management, graduated early, came home, and slid into the company like a missing puzzle piece no one had noticed was gone. Dad called it a smooth transition. What he meant was obedient. For years, I fixed what Tyler broke. I negotiated contracts he bragged about closing, balanced budgets he didn't understand, and watched him get credit for fires I quietly put out. The warehouse guys called me Captain Backup. Then came the phrase that changed everything. It was Christmas Eve 6 years ago. Snow outside, roast beef inside. Tyler talking too loud about some startup deal he was consulting for. I started sharing news about a major client I'd secured, a deal that would double our quarterly revenue. Halfway through, Tyler cut me off. "That's cute, bro," he said, "but you're just moving boxes. I'm building the future." Dad chuckled. Mom hid a smile behind her glass. I remember the sound of the clock ticking over the laughter. Just moving boxes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house hummed with the same comfortable lies that had built it. In the dark, I realized something in this family. Effort didn't matter. Only the illusion of brilliance did. Tyler performed. Dad believed. Mom looked away. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling fan, spinning slow circles, and thought, if they won't see what I build, I'll build something they can't ignore. The next week, I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Project A. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was a backup plan. At 22, I didn't have much, just enough savings, a few contacts from college, and the quiet anger that turns into fuel if you use it right. I registered a small LLC under a neutral name, Asterian Consulting. The name came from a Greek myth, a hidden identity beneath a labyrinth. It felt fitting. For years, Asterian existed in the background of my life, like a shadow that worked when I couldn't. During the day, I was the obedient son, the calm operations manager. At night, I learned the architecture of power, investment vehicles, holding companies, clean paperwork. I studied the language my father never thought I'd speak. And slowly, I started to build. Two small contracts at first companies Dad would have ignored as too minor to matter. But they taught me leverage, patience, how to stay invisible in systems obsessed with visibility. Meanwhile, Mercer Logistics was growing on paper. But behind the shine, the numbers were messy. Tyler's networking trips drained cash. Dad dismissed it as relationship building. When I raised concerns, he waved them off with the same phrase every time. You worry too much, Colin. Family forgives. Maybe family forgives, but balance sheets don't. I began keeping quiet records of everything, the invoices, the wire transfers, the discrepancies. I wasn't plotting yet. I was protecting myself. The thing about being underestimated is that it buys you time. By 28, Dad was half retired. Tyler was playing executive, bouncing from meeting to meeting in suits that didn't fit his work ethic. I was running the company without ever being given the title. And for a while, I convinced myself that was enough, that the warehouse, the routine, the small wins were my version of peace. But every time Tyler opened his mouth at a family dinner, I felt that ceiling fan spinning again, slow, hypnotic, suffocating. I didn't know it then, but that quiet resentment was already blueprinting the empire that would one day swallow my family whole. When I first filed the paperwork for Asterian Consulting, I didn't imagine it would one day become a weapon. I just wanted a space that belonged entirely to me, a ledger no one else could touch, a system without my father's signature on it. At the start, it was nothing glamorous. I rented a one-room office above an auto shop downtown, the kind of place where the lights flickered when the AC kicked on. The desk was secondhand. The coffee machine groaned like it hated its job, and the walls smelled faintly of gasoline. But it was mine. I spent my nights there, learning, not from classes or mentors, from mistakes. I bought stakes in small freight brokers, tiny warehousing startups, niche software tools for logistics scheduling. Most failed. A few survived. The survivors paid for the next step. During the day, I was still Mercer Logistics' reliable son. During the night, I was something else entirely, someone who no longer needed permission to create. The irony was brutal. Everything I knew about efficiency, cost control, and negotiation, I learned from the company that refused to acknowledge me. My father had built me into the perfect architect for my own escape. One night, around 2 in the morning, I got an email from an old classmate, an accountant at a mid-tier shipping firm. Hey Colin, is Mercer Logistics changing payment accounts? I frowned. Not that I know of. He forwarded the invoice. The bank account listed wasn't ours. I cross-checked it. The routing number led to an entity called Mercer Innovations, LLC. It didn't exist in our records. When I brought it up at work the next morning, Tyler laughed like it was nothing. Relax, man. Tax optimization. Everyone does it. It's temporary. Dad didn't even look up from his coffee. Let it go. He's experimenting. Experimenting. That was his word for it. I called it theft. That night, I printed the invoice and slipped it into a folder labeled insurance. It would not be the last page in that folder. Over time, the distance between us became geography. Dad started working from home. Tyler started spending more time in client meetings that looked suspiciously like rooftop parties. and I stayed behind the desk, steering the ship they didn't realize was already drifting. Every time they dismissed me, I built something new. Asterion evolved from a consulting firm into a small private investment group. Quiet capital, quiet moves. By my 30th birthday, it was pulling enough revenue that I could have walked away comfortably. But I stayed. I told myself I needed closure, a clean break. Looking back, I realize I stayed for the same reason. People stare at fires not to stay warm, but to make sure they don't burn alone. Then came the breaking point. It was spring, and one of our major clients, an old trucking conglomerate, called me directly. "Colin, this new payment process doesn't match last quarter's. Should we still be wiring to the Florida account?" There was no Florida account. I checked. Tyler had opened another shell entity this time, with a fake operations address. The funds were moving from client to shell, shell to consulting expenses, then gone. When I confronted him, he just smirked. "You're too uptight. Dad gets it. This is how the big players move money. Big players don't steal from their own company." He leaned closer, grin hardening. "You sound jealous." I laughed, once the kind of laugh that cuts instead of softens. "I'm not jealous, Tyler. I'm just done cleaning up after you." The next day, I went to Dad. He listened, sighed, then said the same thing he always said. "He's young, Colin. Don't make it worse by holding a grudge." I stood there for a long time, realizing I wasn't angry anymore. Just empty. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't part of the Mercer family business. I was its unpaid insurance policy. So I made my decision. I stayed for another 12 months, long enough to make sure every contract, every operational system, every client file was stable without me. Then, quietly, I sold my shares. When the paperwork reached Dad's desk, he called me, furious. "What is this? You're walking out?" "I'm just doing my own thing," I said evenly. "You've got Tyler. He's your future, right?" The line went silent. Then he hung up. For months afterward, I didn't hear from any of them. The silence was heavy but clean, like standing in a house after a storm. Meanwhile, Asterion kept growing. I took what I'd learned and used it ruthlessly. While my father and brother fought over trucks and leases, I bought into software that predicted freight bottlenecks, small AI firms that optimized delivery routes, and transport infrastructure shares everyone else ignored. It was almost poetic. I was still moving boxes, just on a global scale. Every holiday, the calls from Mom came. "You should come by, Colin. Your father misses you." "Does he?" I'd ask. She'd sigh, the kind that meant no but wanted yes. "You're both stubborn. It's Christmas." The first few years, I said no. Then, one December, curiosity outweighed caution. I said yes. That was last Christmas, the one where Rick Mercer announced to a room full of family that he was selling the company to Asterion Capital. The one where Tyler grinned like he'd just inherited the world. And the one where I looked at them both and said, "Dad, I am Asterion." I can still remember the taste of the air, that moment, burnt pine from the fireplace, the sweet and sour of spilled wine, the metallic hum of a lifetime snapping in half. They thought it ended there. It didn't. Because what they didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that the real story had just begun. The night I took back the company wasn't the night I won. It was the night they started losing everything they'd ever used to define themselves. I didn't know it then, but revenge isn't born from rage. It's born from clarity. And clarity was all I had left. The morning after that Christmas dinner, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls. Unknown numbers. A voicemail from Dad that started calm and ended furious. "Colin, this isn't funny. You're playing with things you don't understand. Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I sat in my downtown office, the skyline reflected in the glass, and let the quiet sink in. I had finally done it, taken control of what I'd built. But power isn't a trophy. It's a mirror. And in that reflection, I saw what was coming. 3 days later, it started. A local business journal ran a headline: "Family Betrayal. Son Secretly Buys Company from Father." It quoted sources close to the Mercers, all conveniently echoing the same narrative that I'd manipulated an aging man into signing away his legacy. The source was obvious. Rick's fingerprints were all over it. Within hours, my inbox turned toxic. Some investors wanted reassurance. Others wanted distance. Asterion had spent years cultivating the reputation of a clean, analytical firm. Now, we were the headline version of Greek tragedy. Brooke, my CFO, dropped a folder on my desk. Damage control, she said flatly. We're pulling every mention of your name from corporate press. PR's drafting a statement. I nodded. Don't deny anything. Just stick to facts. She raised an eyebrow. You sure you don't want to fight fire with fire? Not yet. Because if I'd learned anything from my father, it was that the loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. By week's end, the first lawsuit arrived: Mercer Logistics versus Colin Mercer. Allegations: fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and deceptive acquisition. In simpler terms, they were suing me for buying something they willingly sold. Brooke read through the papers, exhaling slowly. They're serious. Full litigation, top-tier firm. Of course they are, I said. He's not protecting the company. He's protecting his pride. She looked up. And Tyler? Tyler's not protecting anything. He's just performing. Sure enough, 2 days later, Tyler posted a statement online. You can't choose your family, but you can fight for what's right. It came with a picture of him in front of the Mercer building, sleeves rolled up like he'd built the foundation himself. Thousands of likes. Sympathy flooding in. The golden sun at war with the shadow brother. I could have responded. I didn't. Instead, I did what I always did best. I started documenting. Every transfer, every memo, every message between them and the lawyers. The goal wasn't vengeance. It was protection. Then came the first real blow. Asterion's main software vendor, the one managing our logistics platform, froze our account, pending contract review. The notice cited potential ownership irregularities. Brooks stormed into my office, waving the letter. They're trying to starve us, Colin. If this goes on, our clients will panic. That's the point, I said. Rick knows pressure. He doesn't know patience. Let him think he's winning. She stared at me. And what are you going to do? Wait for him to overreach. Because my father's fatal flaw was always the same: he didn't know when to stop tightening the rope. A week later, I got an encrypted message from our internal IT logs. Unauthorized downloads at 2:13 a.m. The source wasn't an employee, it was a PR firm under contract with Mercer Logistics. Files accessed: financial statements, investor lists, and private correspondence. Brooks' voice dropped. That's not a leak. That's espionage. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the city outside my window. Then let's treat it like one. We locked the systems, traced the IP, and found what I already suspected. The PR firm had been hired by my father, supposedly for reputation management. The irony nearly made me laugh. He'd weaponized the same people meant to polish his image. That night, I drove to the diner just off Route 17, the one that stayed open all night. It smelled like old coffee and fried onions, exactly the kind of place my father would have hated. Jerry Whitman was waiting in a booth by the window. The old man looked smaller than I remembered. Retirement had thinned him out. He'd once been Dad's right-hand man. Long time, I said. He nodded. You look tired. I am. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. You might want to see this. Found it cleaning out the old archives. I unfolded it. A printout of a transfer authorization, Rick's signature, a routing number, and a memo line. Consulting fees, offshore adjustment. My throat went dry. Where's this from? The year before he sold to you, Jerry said. He moved company money into a shell account under Tyler's initials. Called it a restructuring. I sat there, the paper trembling in my hand. It wasn't anger that hit me. It was realization. My father hadn't lost the company by accident. He'd hollowed it out himself and then blamed me for noticing. Outside, a semi rumbled past, shaking the window. Jerry looked at me, eyes tired but sharp. You didn't steal from him, son. You just took back what he already sold to his ego. I stared at the page again. The memo line blurred under the flickering diner light. That's when I knew the war had just changed terrain. The next morning, I spread the diner printout across my desk and stared at it until the coffee went cold. Rick's signature curved across the page, the same way it always had: sharp, confident, final. He'd moved money offshore years before he ever claimed I betrayed him. The hypocrisy was staggering. But more than that, it was useful. Brooke came in without knocking. We traced the PR firm, she said, dropping another file. Guess who was footing the bill? I glanced up. Rick. She nodded. They were being paid through a vendor chain. Mercer Consulting ME. It's a shell. We followed the payments to an offshore account in the Caymans. Guess whose name was attached? Tyler's. Brooke smirked. Bingo. For a long moment, I said nothing. Outside, rain tapped against the window, soft but relentless. It sounded like the world reminding me to stay calm. Keep digging, I said. We won't use it yet. Brooke frowned. He's coming for you in every outlet. We've lost 2 investors already. Why are we still playing quiet? Because the moment he overcommits, I said, we'll have everything we need to end it publicly. That afternoon, I got a call from our main bank. The tone was polite, the message brutal. Mr. Mercer, there's been a request from Mercer Logistics to purchase a portion of Asterian's debt portfolio. It's legal, but unconventional. A hostile debt play. Rick wasn't just attacking my image, he was trying to buy my leverage. If he gained control of the debt, he could force repayment, choke liquidity, and collapse the firm from the inside. I thanked the banker, hung up, and sat there in the darkening office. For the first time in years, I felt something that wasn't anger. It was admiration. My father was going for the jugular. So was I. That night, I drove to my parents' house, the same one where the Christmas toast had happened. The lights were still on, the house looking exactly as it always had. Polished, proud, blind. Rick was in his study, sitting behind the same oak desk he'd used since I was a kid. The smell of his cologne hit me before his voice did. Bold of you to show up, he said, not looking up from his papers. I thought it was time we talked without lawyers. He laughed softly. About what? How you stole my company? I took a breath. You sold it to me. You signed the waiver of conflict. Every document was clean. He looked up then, eyes sharp as glass. Don't hide behind paperwork, Colin. You knew exactly what you were doing. And you didn't? I leaned forward. You moved company funds offshore, paid PR firms to leak stories, and now you're trying to buy my debt. His expression didn't flicker. I built Mercer Logistics from nothing. You built a spreadsheet. I'm just taking back what was mine. You're taking back what you already burned. Silence stretched between us. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He smirked finally, leaning back. You were never the heir, Colin. You were supposed to help the heir. I stared at him, and something inside me went perfectly still. Thanks for the clarification, I said quietly. When I left, Mom was standing by the stairs, wringing her hands. He doesn't mean it, she whispered. Yes, he does, I said. And that's why I have to finish this. The drive back to the city felt longer than usual. The rain had turned to sleet, streaking across the windshield in silver lines. I thought about everything Jerry had shown me, about Tyler's fake accounts, about Dad's debt trap. Every move they made was a confession written in numbers. When I got back, Brooke was waiting in my office, eyes lit by the glow of her laptop. You need to see this, she said. On her screen were screenshots from the internal server logs. Access at 2:13 a.m., the same timestamp as before, but now from Rick's home IP address. Brooke looked up. He wasn't just hiring the PR firm. He was sending them files himself. I smiled for the first time in days. Then we have him. She hesitated. You want to go public? Not yet, I said, eyes on the skyline. The city lights shimmered like data points. He still thinks he's writing the narrative. Let's let him finish his story before we publish ours. Brooke closed her laptop, exhaling. You're colder than I thought. Not cold, I said. Just done pretending. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. The first storm of winter was coming, and with it, the reckoning my father had spent a lifetime postponing. Because sometimes revenge doesn't start with a scream. It starts with silence and ends with evidence. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and fear. That faint scent of old paper and perfume that clings to people trying too hard to look composed. It was early March. Snowmelt streaked down the courthouse steps as I walked in. Brooke walked beside me, tablet in hand, face carved from calm. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed. Reporters whispered. I could feel their lenses tilting toward us like rifles. At the front sat my father, Richard Mercer, crisp as ever in his navy suit. The same one he'd worn to every award ceremony of my childhood. Tyler was beside him, tapping his knee like a child caught in a lie but too arrogant to stop fidgeting. Their lawyer, a woman with steel eyes and a reputation for tearing witnesses apart, adjusted her files with surgical precision. When the judge entered, the room fell into that thick, buzzing silence that always precedes execution. The opening statements were predictable. Their lawyer painted me as the calculating son who'd used corporate disguise to trick his family into signing away their legacy. She spoke about deception, betrayal, and greed, every word laced with moral venom. My father nodded solemnly at the right moments. He'd rehearsed it. He was playing the victim, and the audience, the press. The court was his stage. Then it was our turn. Brooke stood. Her tone was quiet, almost gentle. We won't waste the court's time with emotional appeals. The documents speak for themselves. She tapped her tablet. Screens flickered on. The first slide appeared. A company structure. Map. Simple. Clean. Color-coded. This, she said, is the acquisition path for Mercer Logistics. Every entity involved in the purchase is public record. Every step was filed legally and reviewed by counsel. Mr. Mercer, she nodded toward my father, signed a waiver of conflict of interest and a declaration of informed consent. The opposing lawyer objected. He didn't know who he was selling to. Brooke smiled slightly. That's interesting, because the purchase documents list every SPV, every signatory, and she clicked to the next slide, include this. On the screen appeared a scanned insurance policy. Title: Key Person Coverage Colin Mercer. Brooke turned to the judge. This policy was purchased by Mr. Richard Mercer himself 5 years ago to insure his company against the potential loss of his son, the same man he now claims was inconsequential to its success. A ripple went through the courtroom. My father's face tightened. Brooke continued, unflinching. To obtain this policy, Mr. Mercer was required to submit internal documentation of his son's role, including titles, responsibilities, and a financial valuation of his contribution. These are his signatures, his handwriting, his acknowledgement of Colin Mercer as a key executive asset. The silence after that was suffocating. Tyler whispered something to his lawyer. She didn't look up. Brooke advanced to the next exhibit. Emails between Rick and the PR firm. Timestamp 2:12 a.m., 1 minute before the server logs we traced. Your Honor, Brooke said, these emails were retrieved from Mercer Logistics' own servers. They show coordination with a contracted public relations firm to circulate defamatory narratives during an ongoing civil case. The sender IP matches the residence of Mr. Mercer. The opposing counsel stood. Those could have been fabricated. Brooke didn't let her finish. They weren't. Here's the server authentication trail. Same MAC address. Same timestamp. And she looked directly at Rick. The same typo he's been making in every memo since 2004. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Reporters began scribbling faster. Rick's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Tyler's jaw clenched, his knuckles white. Brooke delivered the final blow like she was reading weather data. We also have a ledger from a storage archive showing internal transfers labeled Consulting Fees Offshore Adjustment, signed by Mr. Mercer. The recipient entity is Mercer Consulting ME, controlled by Tyler Mercer. The judge leaned forward. Do you have verification? Brooke nodded. Bank confirmations, routing numbers. Everything lines up. These weren't mistakes. They were diversions. Rick slammed his palm on the table. You think you can twist this around? You. The judge's gavel cracked the air. Mr. Mercer, control yourself. For the first time in my life, my father looked small. Not defeated yet, but shrinking. The judge turned to their counsel. Would you like to continue or take a recess? The lawyer hesitated. Your Honor, given the new exhibits, we'd like to request an adjournment to review materials. Granted, the judge said. As the gavel came down, Rick exhaled like he'd been punched. Tyler stared at me, eyes burning. You set us up, he hissed. I stood slowly. No, Tyler. You set yourself up. I just took notes. He started to say something, but Rick's hand clamped on his arm. I watched him whisper something low and sharp. Tyler flinched like a child scolded too hard. Brooke packed her tablet. That's checkmate, she murmured. I shook my head. Not yet. This isn't about beating them in court. It's about making sure they can't rewrite the truth again. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner than it had in months. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, cameras flashing. I didn't answer any of them. I just walked down the courthouse steps, one hand in my pocket, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Because it wasn't victory, I felt it was precision. Everything they'd used to control me, money, family, Image was now evidence in my hands. As I reached the car, Brooke looked at me. You good? Better than good, I said quietly. I'm ready for the next part. She frowned. What next part? The one where we stop defending, I said, and start dismantling. I opened the car door, paused, and looked back at the courthouse at the place where my father's empire began to crack. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just hums, steady and undeniable, like the sound of truth turning gears. And somewhere in that low, unstoppable hum, I realized this wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. The next morning, the city felt unnaturally still. The kind of stillness that follows a storm, deceptive, temporary. Brooke texted me just one line. They blinked. By noon, we got confirmation. Rick and Tyler had withdrawn the lawsuit. No press conference, no apology, just a quiet filing buried in the courthouse docket, accompanied by a generic statement about family misunderstandings. But behind that politeness was panic. They knew what we had, and they knew what would happen if it ever saw daylight. Later that afternoon, I met Brooke in the Asterian boardroom. The glass walls reflected the skyline, pale and endless. On the table lay the stack of files, the same ones we dropped in court, plus a few we hadn't used yet. She looked at me carefully. You could bury them now. Move on. Nobody would blame you. I stared at the folders. Burying the evidence doesn't erase what they did. It just plants another seed for someone else to find later. She nodded slowly. So, what now? I slid one document to the side, a ledger we'd recovered from the company archives. At the bottom of the page was a signature I'd stared at my whole life. Richard Mercer. Next to it, a foreign account number, still active. Now, I said quietly, we clean house. That night, I sent an encrypted package to the IRS whistleblower division, complete with every offshore trail, every fake vendor invoice, every digital signature. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need to. The truth could walk without me. Weeks passed. No headlines, no explosions, just silence. Then one morning, Brooke forwarded me an internal memo from one of our contacts. Case under federal review. I sat there, staring at those 3 words until the letters blurred. I didn't feel triumphant, just finished. Then, just as I started to believe the storm had passed, a package arrived at my office. No return address, no note, just a small padded envelope with a flash drive inside. I plugged it into my laptop. One file, a scanned contract, header, Port of Fairhaven Infrastructure Expansion Agreement, signed by Richard Mercer. And below it, a clause I'd never seen before. Kickback, 8% payable to offshore account. Project Liaison, R.M. My pulse slowed. I leaned back, the city lights flickering across the glass. So this wasn't over. Not yet. They thought I'd taken everything from them. But what they didn't know, what they never understood, was that I hadn't even started. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, you know this feeling, that cold mix of justice and emptiness. I used to think revenge meant destroying what hurt you. But I've learned it's quieter than that. It's building something they can't touch. It's sleeping through the night knowing you never have to ask for permission again. And as for that flash drive, let's just say what's on it might change everything you thought was over. So, don't go anywhere. This story isn't done. Part 2. The port deal is coming soon.